Roland, I appreciate you coming on right now.
It's an honor.
You're author of multiple books, Mad Game, Blood on the Horns, and Michael Jordan in Life. And I feel like all three books tie into the latest documentary, The Last Dance, which is airing on ESPN right now. On a technical aspect, is there anything that you were a fan of so far?
On the documentary,
Yes.
just about all of it. There are certain things I have some issues with, um, but all in all, it's pretty awesome to see when you get an outfit like ESPN and all the resources. Um, this is also NBA entertainment.
Right.
When you get all those resources aimed at telling a story, wow.
Were anything, because you read so much and you interview so many individuals for your book and your different books, have there been anybody that or any scenario that you want to interview that you haven't yet?
Yes. Number one on that list is Andy Thompson, Clay's uncle.
Okay.
Andy Thompson, this was his film. He did all the field production. Andy went everywhere that season. In 97, 98, that was a minefield. You had all this conflict going on within the Bulls, and Andy Thompson was there with NBA Entertainment. He had the film crew. And you can give a film crew access, but you have to have people who understand the lay of the land and how to relate to people, how to have the eye to know what to shoot, the full understanding to know the people to interview. And so this film sat there, all this footage that Andy shot as the field producer, it sat there for 20 years. I would see Andy in NBA events, locker rooms, at the finals or the All-Star game. I'd say, Andy, when are they going to make your film? Because he put his heart and soul in it. And that was a big part of this. It was Andy's story in my mind. And I understand they want to bring in a director and they're going to do what they do. That's the way it's the way the world works. But I think it would have been really cool to open up somewhere in the first section with an interview with Andy about all of this. He's one of the most knowledgeable people there is. And you talk about a classy guy and a smart guy. And so, number one, I'm missing Andy Thompson's take on all this because he is the champion of all of this footage. And I want to see more of that footage from back then. I know they've got to tell, this is basically telling Jordan's life.
Right.
And so then the other thing that's sad, having waited all this time, as I went through all this, Tex Winter was a tremendous help to me because, he was close with Phil. He was close with Krause. Tex really cared about that team. He cared about every team he coached. He coached Michael longer than anybody. And he and Michael would have their moments, but, Tex was that guy who could be honest with him. And Tex could never be anything but honest. And that was the fault of his, but it was also, it really worked in what they were doing. Tex, when they got to the Lakers, they knew they had to have Tex around when Phil Jackson and Tex got to the Lakers because they didn't have anybody to stand up to Phil Jackson. And that's important in all these teams. You got strong personalities, whether it's a player, a coach, general manager. You got strong personalities. You got to have checks and balances. You're going to have people that can stand up to them. That's the thing about strong competitive personalities um, that is often overlooked. And so I wish they had done this earlier, because Texas Voice would have been a powerful thing if they'd have wanted to listen. Krause, I think he needs to be alive to speak for himself. Um, the guy did a lot of important things. He just would not. He'd been bullied so much in so many ways. He was the biggest bully of all, because you have to be bullied sometimes to become a bully. And he was so used to fighting for whatever he got. He got no respect all those years as a scout. And so he tended to be a really tough dude to deal with. So it would be good, and they have his voice, but I wish they'd done it years ago. But that goes to the other thing. I think Michael held off on approving this project going forward all these years. And Michael told me, I sat down with him in 2008 at the pre-draft camp. We were up in the Rafters, just Mike and me. Last time I really got a good sit down with him. And I was asking about Kobe. Kobe was on his way to that MVP season. And it was obvious how proud Michael was of Kobe. And later I went to the Lakers locker room in the playoffs, right after I talked to Mike. And Kobe was sitting over there tying his shoes. And I was talking to somebody. I looked up. I said, Kobe, I've been talking to Mike about you. And his ears perked up like a little kid's. What? What did he say? You know? So there was a revealing moment for this sort of club the two of them had. But the main thing Michael told me was a profound statement, which really became a big part of Michael Jordan, the life, the 700-page biography. One of my buddies had just read it and called me. I said, thank you for reading that. I don't care if it's 700 pages of whatever. It's hard to read a 700-page book. And so I'm honestly grateful for anyone that can get through it all. But one of the things Michael told me that day in Orlando is timing is everything. He was talking about his own life. And obviously, when you look at Michael's life, he was blessed with perfect timing. And while I would wish this film had come out years ago, I think we're all locked in Michael's perfect timing. You think about it, here we are in the coronavirus. The world is scared to death. We can't go anywhere. There's no sports on TV. And here we are with hours and hours and hours of Michael Jordan. And the main impression we get from that, everybody gets to see it. You know, I don't get into the debates about who's the greatest. I just don't think that's my place. And I'm a writer. I study this stuff. I've interviewed all the people. But I'm not going to disrespect any one of these great players by saying one is greater than the other. They all go out on that floor. To be a great player, you're playing 12, 16, 20 years. You're doing that night after night after night. You are doing amazing things. For some writer to sit back and say, oh, yeah, he's the GOAT, or, oh, yeah, he's this, or he's all that, that's not how it is. Each of the careers these guys lay down and put on the record speaks for itself. I don't get into ranking them. I wrote that 700 pages on Jordan without calling him the greatest. It wouldn't matter if I did. Everything he did speaks to that. It's not something I'm going to say that is going to matter in any way. So this is my long way of saying Jordan's timing's perfect on this because everybody gets to stop and look at how crazy competitive that dude was. Not just how crazy competitive. I mean, and he ran everybody. I was talking, the guy I was talking with, we played a little football in college together. And we had a guy on our team from Florida. I remember the first day of practice, we were freshmen. Freshmen weren't eligible. We played our own schedule. We scrimmaged the varsity. But I was playing linebacker, and he was double lead out of the backfield. This guy was an alpha male to the max. He knocked the living, I've never been hit like that in my life. I'm lying there in the dirt. He's lying there in the dirt. He's faced away from me. He's got a piece of tape across the back of his helmet. It says, "God bless us all, and may we have a good game." And I'm sitting there thinking, this dude's out here killing people, and he's thinking that. But he was an alpha male. And he drove our team. We just, Jordan is the kind of guy that sends you taking a deep dive into your own experience. And Jordan drove that entire Chicago Bulls franchise. Now, he was a very fierce, he could be mean, he could be rude, he could be ruthless, he could be all these negative things, but he had everybody scared to death in one way or another, or feeling challenged to the max. That included Jerry Reinsdorf, the man who owned the team, Jerry Krause. Now, Krause had this thing where he would want to go back at Jordan and bully the bully the bully. And, it worked as long as it did for 6 championships. But everybody else in their franchise, they talk about how Phil Jackson handled Dennis Rodman. And Phil obviously is a great coach. He did things. But it was Dennis. I've known Dennis since he first came in the league. I used to do a lot of Pistons work. Dennis is a relationship guy. He was, and he for a guy who's hard for the public to read, relationship and hard for him to have relationships. He had a series of relationships. He had a huge relationship with Tex Winter that hasn't been reported in the film. They just don't get into that. But it was Michael Jordan that kept all that in line. He kept that whole franchise. He set the agenda for winning. I don't know why my machine blacks out while we're talking, but he kept that whole franchise on the move. And so people watching this are beginning to get that. The other thing, and my wife and I were talking about this last night, while we're all sitting here, we're watching Jordan, and I'm sorry to talk so long, but I sometimes have long answers to questions.
No, go ahead, man.
But I just want to finish with this. That dude's athleticism, not just his athleticism, his ability to fly, his way. Now, I'm a huge fan of a lot of other people. Kobe Bryant had his thing. I think LeBron is an amazing player, an amazing person. I think that, you have some of those old time dudes, watching Kareem shoot that sky hooker. But there has never been a player who went that 94 feet on the hardwood doing the things the way Jordan did them. I'm writing a book now about Magic Johnson, who, again, it's sort of like, as I say as I'm writing the book, it's like Jimi Hendrix playing guitar. You get some killer guitar players, but there's nobody running a break like Magic Johnson ever again. I don't care how long you play the game. There's nobody going end to end or doing the things he did, all the ways he attacked, with all the with all the beauty in a lot of ways, that was Jordan. Now, you can say the same thing about Earl the Pearl. You can pick out different people, and they all have their own sort of individual mark stylistically. And let's face it, that's part of this conversation too. But Jordan may have been the most stylish, ruthless dude I've ever encountered. And that's on full display here, which I personally believe. I know they finally came up with $20 million to pay the group for Mike. I don't think he cares about that $20 million. He wanted to make this statement about who he was. And here that timing is. Once again, timing is everything for him. And here it is for the world. People have been calling me from, I had to go coast to coast on radio in Australia right after the first segment finished. They've been calling me from all over the world about this. Nobody used to care about American basketball. They're still living off a lot of the fumes he created everywhere. I'll shut up. I'm sorry.
No, man, that's very interesting. You said that. If you can you elaborate more about the mind of Jerry Krause? Because I see that the last couple of weeks, they give him a lot of flack for, I guess his ego got the best of him.
Oh, I think the ego got the best of him years before that. But Jerry Krause, Phil Jackson called him sort of like the mayor that nobody likes. But that's just a jab. Jerry Krause was a guy that always wanted to be, he always wanted to, he was the backup catcher on the baseball team. He would get to warm up the pitchers. I understand some of that. I played college football as a walk-on. Practice every day was my Super Bowl. You know, there are people who just don't have it, but Krause was a guy, he just had a way of sticking his nose in there and finding trouble. And you can just see it. And he was in Chicago for years, and he was disrespected in Chicago. They pretty much considered Jerry Krause a joke. Now, he was a really good scout, but he was crazy about it. Even the other scouts didn't know what to make of the sleuth. You know, he went around in a detective coat almost. He was so secretive about everything. But he had a vision, and the vision is what is pretty amazing. He wanted to hire Tex Winter with that triangle. That was the first hire he made. See, he had worked, scouted for the Baltimore Bullets. He had scouted for the Lakers. He was good at finding players. You know, it's the players that he was one of the first guys to go out and really heavily scout black college basketball. There was a lot of stupidity and arrogance in scouting. And one thing about Krause, he was none of that. Now, he ended up in the worst kind of conflict that has the worst optics in history of sports probably now with this series. But he would always tell Michael, look, man, Earl the Pearl. You know, Earl the Pearl started in Baltimore, and Krause was a Baltimore guy in terms of working for that organization.
Right.
And that would get Michael going. That's really where they started to get off track with each other in the early days, because Krause would just poke the bear, you know, and he just had no sense of who Michael was and the trouble he was making with that nonsense. But it's a funny part of the story if you just look at it in the vacuum of the time. But Krause comes along, and he does a good job scouting or working for Jerry Reinsdorf. And Jerry Reinsdorf says, okay, what do you want to do? And Krause says, and the Bulls were nothing. They wouldn't even take down the Hoxie plexiglass from the Blackhawks when the Bulls games were played. You had to watch the Bulls through the hockey plexiglass. and they were bought for a song and a dance. Chicago pro basketball teams had folded. You had the Chicago Duffy Florals. Who names a basketball team the Duffy Florals? You had all these different pro teams in Chicago that folded. It was the graveyard. And Krause was the joke of Chicago. And Reinsdorf and his buddies got the Bulls for $10 million, something like that. Some outrageously cheap. And people thought it was a bad deal at the time. But Krause asked Reinsdorf to let him run the Bulls. Because Krause had worked for the Bulls. He had been the GM of the Bulls back in the mid-'70s. He'd been on the job about 3 months. And they said, we got to let you go. You're fired. They got rid of him. And everybody just laughed at him. And it may have been a little later. I have to go back and check. I've written all this and interviewed all these people, but it was in the 70s. It may have been a little later in the 70s, but he had been laughed out of town in terms of the Bulls. And so he wanted back. First thing he did was hire Tex Winter, the triangle guy. And Michael had a series of coaches that were just like anybody else. If you're a coach and you see what Michael can do, and you're dealing with your roster, you're saying, everybody else get out of the way, man. Just get out of the way. Let this dude roll. And that's what I've coached a lot. There are times when you're coaching, I mean, the truth comes at you like a train with a big old headlight. And you gotta, and Michael needed that. Michael needed to be the beast in the early years. And it showed him, and we see this, and you've heard Michael say it finally. He didn't like this triangle stuff when it happened. But Krause had scouted Phil Jackson at the University of North Dakota in college. D2 Phil Jackson. You've seen footage of him. I mean, it's not like, but Krause had seen it. That was his big secret, you know. He was the sleuth. He was going to slip in there and get Phil Jackson with a second, third round pick for the Baltimore Bullets. And the Knicks, you know, they saw it too, and they drafted Phil ahead of him. Krause was so upset over that, and so he kept trying to get Phil hired. And Phil is the guy who wrote a book about winning the championship with the Knicks and eating LSD and partying on the beach in Los Angeles in '73. And so
Maverick. Nobody
in the NBA wanted goofy ass Phil Jackson as their coach. Come on. I mean, he was a joke in his way too, you know. This was sort of Krause having a different vision. He thought Phil Jackson was another Bill Bradley, another really bright guy. He knew Tex Winter was a basketball genius. And Krause's vision, in addition to drafting guys like Oakley, you know, he was the one, man, you know. It's not rocket science, perhaps, but there are a lot of, you know, everybody wants to get into the tags on people. Oh, yeah, he's All-American. He's, you know, he's on this list, or he's highlighted by the SEC or the ACC. And Scottie Pippen was a 6'1" high school point guard who went to college as the team manager. And he grew. Heck, Dennis Rodman didn't even play high school basketball. And Scottie had those long arms and all that athleticism. He just changed at Central Arkansas, as you saw in the earlier segments. But at the time, and I mean, the scouts were into that, but Krause was the one ready to go all in, make the trade, get Scottie, get Horace. He was willing to trade one of his prized recruits, Oakley, to get Bill Cartwright. And why would they want Bill Cartwright? Well, he fit into all this triangle scheme. All these kinds of things just dug him in deeper with Michael. But when it all came together, when Tex, and particularly Phil's genius at the Chicago Bulls was forming that relationship with Michael and easing him into the triangle offense. At a moment when Michael was ready, he had had his ass kicked enough by the Pistons that he was going to listen, because he already had all the accolades, but he wasn't getting anywhere on what really mattered. And again, they need somebody to sit up there on that show and say, Michael had the character to know that. Michael had all of the essentials to know that. Just like Anthony Tichy told me back when I was doing Michael Jordan, The Life. Nobody's ever given MJ credit for having the character to play for Dean Smith at North Carolina. You have to understand, you look at tape, you can see it. Carolina had such a system, you couldn't tell who was athletic. Not really. You couldn't tell what people could do because it was such a tightly controlled system. And so at the critical moment in his life, Phil Jackson was selling Michael Jordan on the triangle. And Michael Jordan, it took a while. They had to ease the triangle in. You know, it's a two-guard front. It's two guards up top. One of them initiates the offense. Other one flips through to the corner.
Right.
And that means you got a good shooter in the corner. It's just an unbalanced floor. And you leave somebody like Mike on the weak, or Kobe on the weak side with three defenders on the other side. It's hard to double team them. It's an opportunity to feast, as you know. And they started the Bulls triangle version with a one guard front because they just didn't want to get too radical right away. They eased into that. Once it got going, you did have a lot more ball movement. Some of those guys didn't remember too much what to do with the ball once they got it. But Michael continued his brilliance in the midst of that. As they all said, that the offense was for everybody else. Michael, it didn't matter. You know, the great players don't need an offense run for them. They don't need plays called. They don't need any of that stuff. But that's another long answer to your question. But Krause was the guy, for whatever reason, a guy who missed so many points, who was blind to so many nuances. Of course, that probably would have meant a perfect world where Krause was like brilliant at all this stuff with all his foresight and then totally in tune with everybody and not having his own agenda because he was hurting the way he was. You know what I mean? If Krause hadn't been that guy who'd been bullied and laughed at, I don't think any of this we'd be having this conversation. And so when I did Blood on the Horns, I said, who's responsible for this breakup? And the answer is, yeah, they all are. They all had their piece of it. And I hope that's what comes clean in this documentary, because Phil did some really low stuff that drove a lot of Krause's anger. And I ended up in the middle of it. I didn't know. I was just writing a Bulls history, and Phil was telling me stuff that he knew would just rip. And they were already arguing over money. That's why they had a falling out.
Right.
And then they started falling out over the things they were telling me. And it went on, that was in 94, 95. It went on 4 more years. And it blew up a little more each year until that 97 playoffs. But they were all responsible. MJ should never have abused the general manager the way he did on that team bus. And, there are all kinds of conflicts that Krause overstepped his bounds. Phil would beg him, the GM shouldn't be on that team bus. That's pressure those players don't need around them. That's their place. That locker room is their place. And Jerry just had such a need to try to be one of the guys. That guy had always sort of been shut out of that. He couldn't help himself. And Phil gave me some very graphic examples of how Krause had this need to just put himself in and among the team at ridiculous times. You saw one of them where he was dancing after they finally beat the Pistons. That videotape went around sort of underground for a long time, but it was sort of a legendary videotape of Krause coming out and dancing. And, when you finally get to see it, I remember the first time I saw it, I thought, well, this is just, everybody's talking about how funny it is. And I thought, this is just pathetic. It's sad that those guys have all that success. They're on their way. And there's no ability to enjoy each other. And they were all angry with Krause by then. I mean, Michael was furious with him. Scotty was on his way to being very angry. Phil was still in the grateful phase. He was very grateful. As Tex Winter explained to me, Phil bent over backward for Jerry Krause for about 5 years. And he finally said, they got an argument over money. He said, look, I can't do this anymore. And Tex didn't blame him at all. Wow. And Tex was very appreciative of Krause for bringing him in.
I know we're only 4 episodes in. But if you want to elaborate on the stuff that did not have shown yet on the episodes.
Well, they've shown, this is where I have a little bit of trouble. They've shown Krause wanting to get rid of Scotty in the summer of 97, him wanting to get rid of Phil in the summer of 97. They don't explain how Krause was abused by that team during the playoffs, the 97 finals in Utah. Just how hard in front of everybody, all the team laughing. It was a real bullying session from Michael. Jerry Krause, Michael be at the back of the bus. They have beaten Utah, drinking a beer. They're all celebrating, being players. And here's Krause. And Krause could have gone to the hotel any way he wanted. There's no need for him to be on that bus. And Michael just lightened him up. Jerry Krause, let's go fishing. Don't worry. If we don't catch anything, you can just eat the bait yourself. And Michael had that vicious sense of humor that he used to police that team. They'd get on that bus after a game, and he would be talking stuff, and everybody would be laughing. But they'd be scared to death that they'd laugh too hard, and he'd look at them and start in on them. Michael terrorized those guys a lot. He was an alpha male. And that's what drove that whole franchise. Now, you can say Jerry Krause shouldn't have been the way he was. Michael was rocking his own set of factors from childhood, from adolescence, from his teen years. And he stored that stuff in his heart like nuclear fuel, man. Some of it we know about. Obviously, they make a lot about Laney not being on that varsity when he was a sophomore. But what happened to him in baseball? You can just imagine. Michael was the Little League Player of the Year for the entire state of North Carolina when he was 12 years old. Took his team within a whisker of the Little League World Series, was a pitcher, threw 2 no-hitters on the way. in the elimination game in the regionals, he tied it up in late innings by hitting a 240-foot home run. Now, baseball was his father's game. Michael was not favored by his father. His father did not approve of Michael. It was Larry, Michael's older brother by 11 months, that James Jordan adored and put all his praise on. Larry was mechanical. You've heard all of that.
Yeah.
But here was Michael in baseball. James Jordan was telling people about that home run for years in Chicago. You talk with him, that conversation is going to go around to Michael at 12 years old hitting that home run. It was Michael at 12 years old had his father. And the very next year, he went up to Dixie League, I think it was called. You know, and the base paths were longer. He was playing with older players. He hardly got off the bench. He never made an all-star team in Dixie League. When he played school ball, he was never more than honorable mention all district. And what we know about the personality of Michael Jordan, everybody says, oh, yeah, gambling. He went off to play baseball. That had nothing to do with gambling. Everybody in the NBA gambles. Whether you're kicked out of the league or not depends on if you gambled on games. Michael has never gambled on a game. You can go to the darkest recesses of the internet, and you're not going to find anybody who makes any allegation that he ever bet on a basketball game. And I've done the NBA Finals. I've interviewed all the old timers all the way back. They gambled traveling on trains before they were traveling on planes, and they would bet. They gambled at golf, at anything you could do. It's a gambling league. The illegal gambling is betting on games.
Right.
And so Michael had this hardwired personality. He was a bully. James Worthy was the first one to tell me, Michael's a bully, and he bullied me. I was a junior. Michael was a freshman at North Carolina, and Michael bullied me. And so each and every one of the people in the top figures in this franchise, contributed to the breakup. The more major the figure, the more the contribution. Michael was abusing Krause on that bus. That is what turned Krause radioactive. That's why it wasn't that one thing. It was a bunch of them. The players got uncomfortable with it. That, as angry as they all were, as fed up as they were a lot of times with the ways Krause could disrespect them. And so Michael overstepped his reach there. Overstepped. You can't have the star of the team abusing a GM in front of everybody like that. It put Phil under great pressure. Phil would try and look back at Michael, but it just put Phil right there to show how truly ineffective he was at because he used that situation, Phil did. He used their anger with Krause and his own anger with Krause to drive the focus of that team. And so it came apart there. Scotty, it's understandable why Scotty was in the situation he was in. He had a bad back. He had come out of a very tough situation economically with a large family in the South, in a middle town where you were just there to be used. That's the big truth of a lot of American mill towns in that part of the 20th century and before. You were just there to be used. And so with his back bad, he wanted that 7-year contract. Here's where Krause contributed to it. He warned Scotty not to sign that contract, and it very quickly became a terrible deal. But Krause, like we said, not Krause, but Reinsdorf had bought the team for $10 million. by the time they'd come along to these issues, that team was getting close to $1 billion in value. It's a couple of billion today. He's sitting there as the owner, pursuing a strategy of trying to cut Scotty off out of the team, not pay Phil, play tough on the money when these guys. He did the same with Jordan. He told Jordan he was going to regret giving him that $30 million contract. That was part of Jordan's anger with Reinsdorf. And they had made all that money. They had season tickets sold across the horizon. They could have played golden oldies for 10 years with MJ, and nobody would have cared if they'd have gone on winning a few more championships. That Chicago would have been a happy party for a long time. But Reinsdorf didn't want to pay him. He had the money. He didn't want to pay him. That's another big factor in the breakup of this team. Because that's really what this story is about. How did this great team break up? They were worried Scotty was breaking down physically. And it also came back big time to Krause's ego. He wanted to prove. He would sit with me and tell me in interviews, it's been great having Jordan here. I love the things we built about him. I love all this winning. But I got my own ego. I'm eager to rebuild this team and show everybody I can win championships again. And I remember listening to him telling me that, thinking, this guy's a loon. He's crazy. This stuff you don't go out and manufacture things that almost come to you by the grace of God. You have all these people show up. Yeah, they got if they didn't have personal differences, they developed them soon enough. That's what success will do to you. But you had this coalition of talent and insight and people and relationships. And of course, my main man, Tex Winter, the honest dude at the center of it all, who he just was such a huge factor. And he really helped me as I was, covering all that stuff, interviewing people, trying to sort out everybody's pain, trying to sort out Michael's pain. And Michael doesn't toss off his pain. He keeps that stuff in his nuclear reserves. That stuff is nuclear fuel rods for Michael. It never leaves him. And a lot of people take negativity and difficulty and turn it into power to accomplish things. That's a wonderful way to deal with things. Michael just had this ability. It didn't even have to be true. It just had to be something that he could imagine or fantasize enough, because he played in that state, that elevated state. Another part of the question is, what else do I want? I want to hear from George Mumford. George Mumford is the mindfulness guy who worked with the Bulls. He was huge in Michael's life. When Michael that season talked about being in the moment, that was all of George's teachings. When Phil, when I was working with Kobe, he was a young trouble guy, totally lost. And I introduced him to Tex. I was rebounding free throws for Kobe in the Forum one day during the 99 playoffs. They were getting their butts kicked in the first round, getting swept by San Antonio. And I had known Kobe for 3 years by then, and would have phone conversations with him about stuff, but he was just so frustrated, so lost and lonely. And so I got Tex to call him. And Tex became, of course, his Yoda. But that season, I also had gotten George Mumford to fly down to Houston. And I introduced him to Kobe courtside before a regular season game in Houston. And this was before George had gone to work for the Lakers. And Kobe looked at him and said, let me get this straight. As tough as the NBA schedule is, Phil Jackson will stop practice and have everybody sit on the floor and meditate with you. And George went, yeah. And Kobe was incredulous. He didn't believe it. And of course, very soon after that, George Mumford came to work for the Lakers. And the one thing that Shaq and Kobe could agree on was George Mumford. He was their secret weapon. He knew how to take the pressure off those guys and to keep them in the moment, the thing that Michael found so valuable. And, George was eventually let go by the Lakers. Just complicated. No good reason except certain people didn't make the case that he still needed to be there. But years after, in 2016, Kobe called up George Mumford and said, man, why don't you come out to LA, come out to Southern California. I got to talk to you. And so George flew out there, Kobe's expense. Kobe put him on that damned helicopter and they flew all over. And Kobe flew him down to Southern California where he had all his companies and all the stuff he was doing. And he just wanted to thank George. He said, I've never forgotten a word you've ever told me. And it was such a big thing. And I'm eager they've interviewed George for this. I hope at some point that in these next episodes, we see more of George Mumford, more of Andy Thompson, and more people that maybe really kind of explain this Krause Jordan thing with a little more nuance. Some people think it smacks of a couple articles written in this. It smacks of Jordan trying to do some score settling when Krause is dead and can't really reflect on these things for himself.
Right.
I will say, and I've mentioned this before, when I was doing this book, Michael Jordan, The Life, I spent a good bit of time with Krause. He was generous to give me time like so many other people. And talking about all those days. And some of the time he stood up against Jordan was legit stuff. Some of it was his character and personality flaws that created the problem. And sometimes you got to stand up to people if you're going to run a team. And it would take a lot to sort out when he should have stood up to Michael and when he shouldn't have. But sometimes he did. But Krause told me, he said, I've got all these videotapes of all these great games, all these championships, and I've never watched one of them. He told me that maybe about a year before he died. I hope he relented at some point, got to sit down and look at the accomplishment of his life.
Right.
And understand. I remember being young and having some success and thinking, man, I'm on my way. You don't know what's coming your way. You don't, everything you get every day, the lesson in all of this in life is whatever blessing you have, you better hit your knees or pray to whomever. Keep as honest as you can with yourself. Nothing is guaranteed. You may think you're the greatest general manager. You're going to just be able to dial up another championship team. No. This is to have this gift in the face of humanity is broad and ultimately tragic and painful. Most people are lucky. We got what, 8 billion on the planet? Most are lucky to get a little cold rice and a little rat meat in the morning. Whatever you get, that's the lesson of this, really. People were making assumptions that it was about them. Jerry Krause was guilty of that. He was mainly the one guilty of that. But I will tell you, they all own a piece of it, some more than others.
Well, that's deep, man. I have a couple more questions. We'll be done.
Sure.
You talked about it a little bit. If you don't mind, can you just expound more on the history of, I guess, the involuntary conspiracy theory behind the gambling side of Jordan?
Yeah, there are certain things that were said in public. When Michael said, if Mr. Stern allows me back in the league, or things like that, conspiracy theories fly on flags like that. I look at the facts, and I don't care if I have no agenda. I mean, obviously, if I'm writing a 700-page book about Michael, I've pissed him off. So I'm not here to. I'm not trying to ingratiate myself with Michael. I'm just dealing with the facts. The facts are he was worn out. All of this stuff, he had laid his heart on the line, and the league did its investigations. He was gambling on golf down at Hilton Head and other places. He loved to gamble on golf. He ran with some shady characters. We've all done that. I don't gamble on golf. I've gambled on other things. I'm a hillbilly from Virginia. I run with my share of shady characters. I know an awful lot of people that are like that. But they investigated it. There was nothing there. I mean, there was no allegation anywhere at that time. And see, part of that was the job of the media. I don't blame the media for a lot because I am the media and I love it. But somebody should have had the clarity to say, well, if they're going to just suspend Jordan, they must have evidence he bet on basketball. But nobody ever boiled it down to that. They took a little piece of this, a little piece of that, and blew it up. And let's face it, that has driven an awful lot of traffic over the years on things. But just follow me through the facts a minute.
Right.
Michael comes back to the game. The league was talking. They had discussions about getting a fund of $50 million to pay him to come back. Does that sound like somebody who ran off for gambling? Now, when they got back, where were the Bulls soon playing preseason games? Vegas. I was there with them. Now, if you have a star that you've disciplined for gambling, you're going to come back and have preseason games in Vegas? Now, the only reason you could have suspended him legally is if he gambled on basketball. Nobody, and none of these conspiracy people and all their trolling and all their bullshit has ever come up with an allegation that he bet on basketball. He comes back. They're playing games in Vegas. We know about his father in baseball. The murder of his father. I understand we tend to think that MJ is not human. I was a crime reporter before I ever got into this. I covered murder trials. I've covered terrible events. You're a family member of a beloved person murdered. It's a stain on your soul. It never leaves you. Michael's off playing minor league baseball, grieving for his father. He comes back with all the anger of grief. He was an angry dude before, and so many NBA players are silently angry. They play from anger. Basketball is an emotional game, always has been since it was first invented. But he comes back, and they're playing in Vegas. He goes on, he makes billions more. He blows this up into a global enterprise. Okay, he's Michael Jordan. He's in Vegas almost a decade later. All-Star game. He is about to be voted on to be an NBA owner, the Bobcats. He's there the night before the Board of Governors vote, shooting craps like a madman. He's shooting craps with Pac-Man Jones. I did a long recorded interview with Pac-Man, who's a really good guy. I did a long recorded interview with Pac-Man about this. It was a pivotal night in Pac-Man's life. Pac-Man wins $1 million from MJ shooting craps, and MJ goes on to lose $5 million shooting craps that night. He's about to be voted on by the NBA Board of Governors to be an owner. The one event that's going to make him a billionaire. All these other guys that are keeping track of their money and trying to catch him, because that's now how they're keeping score. Magic Johnson sitting at $500 million. Man, he would love to get a piece of something like his own NBA franchise. This is no small thing for MJ. He's not even given his gambling a thought. Why? He's never bet on basketball. He doesn't, that's not the issue. If you look at the facts, there's nothing there that gives you any reason to think that the NBA would chase him off. The circumstances chased him off, pushed him over the edge. MJ continues to gamble as he wants. He's a team owner. If he were engaging in anything, it's very clear what you can do and what you cannot do. It is his money. He can gamble on what he wants, except basketball. And that's the cold truth. That doesn't do much for internet traffic and trolling. It's not sexy. It's not, but I mean, it's just the facts lined up. There's no way if MJ had been betting on basketball games that he would be an owner today. There's no way. They would have brought him back when they brought him back. And the only reason they could get rid of him, or they would have, the only way they would have gotten rid of MJ, who was already making them a fortune. And of course, their big gamble was, well, he's making us a fortune. If we ignore him, if he were betting on games, we ignored him and people found out we did that, that would be the ruination of everything for us. No, we would have nothing. But that's not what they were thinking about. There was no there was no evidence because MJ never bet on basketball games. He was not Pete Rose. Pete Rose is a good example. Pete Rose, I mean, I remember Pete Rose was a stirring baseball player. That dude played all out. I didn't even like Cincinnati, but I had to watch that guy play. If Pete Rose is still walking, dragging the chains around in the hell he's in, you know, this stuff, this is all internet puff. I like to deal in the real world, and Anybody who deals in that, that's my answer to them.
Right. Last question. Tim Floyd, he's the successor for the Chicago Bulls. How should he be remembered? Because I feel like he was tied like in the middle between this madness.
He should be remembered as the guy who didn't have Michael Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jerry West, there used to be arguments. Is it coaching or is it talent? That's an easy question in my mind. Without talent, I mean, coaching can get you can get 500, maybe better in a season. Because bad coaching can mess up a talented team. Don't get me wrong. Bad coaching can do all kinds of things. Even the great Lenny Wilkens we saw in this series, he wouldn't allow Harp to cover MJ on the shot in Cleveland. So there are people who make bad decisions. Good coaches who do, but number one on the list is talent. Now, if Tim Floyd had MJ, we might be talking about him right now for a while. He might have won 3 more titles with MJ there if they had been smart enough to keep Scotty and let those other, instead of ditching all those other guys. They got rid of the whole cultural thing. Tim Floyd's a good coach. You could have put Greg Popovich in there with that roster, that young rebuilding roster. Like I said, they were all working for MJ. They might not have understood it completely at the time. They were all in his employ. He was the force, and that's what this documentary is showing us. And that's what it should show us, because that's the truth.
Roland, man, I appreciate you hopping on, sharing this information.
Well, just my take. I was there a lot. I did have good fortune to talk to everybody. I saw it unfold. I'm sure I'm wrong on some of it, but I don't think much. I'll put a lot of time. You don't write a 700-page book about somebody without thinking a lot about each and everything in their lives.
Like I said, man, I appreciate you coming on, man, and doing this, man. I'm a huge fan, following your work for the last 20 years. Mad Game, Michael Jordan Life, Blood on the Horns, man.
Well, I thank you for all of that. That was a big factor in all those questions that were right to the point on things. I used to teach interviewing in college, journalism, and so much of it is doing the research, having the background, and obviously having done all that. It's just basic respect that we all have to have for each other as humans.
Right.
And I really thank you for that.
Thank you.